everybody. Happy Friday and welcome back to the stream. It is the weekend as soon as we are done with this. For you, not for me, because I am going to be on the incredible, the wonderful, the legendary, and amazing Officer Tatum's show this afternoon. And as you might be able to tell a little bit, my voice is like completely shot and exhausted from doing so much media this week. My eyes are also quite tired from wearing my contacts too long every day this week. Take them out after several hours of use. Actually listen to your eye doctor or your eyes get really tired. So hence my weird man voice and or the glasses situation in all of our content today. But we are here. We are excited. It's Friday. I'm a happy camper and I'm super excited to be spending the afternoon with all of you guys because my voice is going out and I'm going to be a guest on Brandon Tatum's show this afternoon. We're going to have a little bit of a shorter stream today, but there's this really interesting emerging story that I'm dying to get your guys' take on from an environmental perspective, because I feel like 99.9% of the conversations that the world, particularly the Western world, is having about environmentalism are completely ineffective and or pointless in addressing the legitimate environmental problems that our society actually needs to desperately address. And I've been really, really outspoken about all of this stuff for many, many years at this point. It's really bothered me, that you automatically have to be assumed to be a leftist and to support socialism or the Green New Deal or basically be Greta Thunberg's #1 fan in order to say that you care about the environment, because frankly, that's just a load of BS. Conservatives have been championing environmental issues literally since modern conservatism from an American politics perspective has come into the fold, politically speaking. I posted a video about this earlier, but it was Abraham Lincoln that set aside the first public land in America. It was Teddy Roosevelt that championed more environmental issues than any other president in American history and spearheaded the idea of the National Park Service. You're welcome, rest of the world, because our national parks were first and yours all came after that. Richard Nixon, whether you like him, started the EPA, whether you like the agency or not, but he was a conservative Republican president. Donald Trump championed countless conservation issues when he was in office in Washington, D.C., including the largest investment into our National Park Service ever in history since it began under the Great American Outdoors Act, the Trillion Trees Initiative, all kinds of really, really cool stuff. And it's often conservative farmers, ranchers, hunters, fishermen, etc., that embrace the most truly objective and scientific aspects to protecting our environment and conservation than anybody else. We all love our beautiful public spaces. We all love this beautiful land that we've been entrusted to preserve and protect for generations to come. And it really, really bothers me when we've created this political narrative that if you generally would support environmental solutions from the free market, or you generally support smaller limited government, or you happen to support freedom of religion and freedom of expression, automatically you are completely excluded from participating in any conversation about environmentalism, period. But luckily, over the last several years, there have been really wonderful organizations trying to change that narrative and really trying to get the truth out there about conservation, including our amazing friends over at the American Conservation Coalition. I've had Benji on the stream before. We've made some fun content together, done a lot of work with them over the years. I emceed their summit a few summers ago, which was very fun. And I actually got to participate in a really cool event hosted by the American Conservation Coalition, which is America's only right-of-center environmental activism group here for youth Americans, which is very cool. I participated in an event that they put on Monday in Los Angeles, California, coinciding with the Schwarzenegger Institute. Got to meet former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, which was very, very cool. But got really into the nitty gritty to participate in this conversation from a bipartisan perspective about youth environmentalism and conservation and why people don't seem to understand that this isn't a partisan issue for us. So that event was covered by The Hill, and they put together some really cool coverage and interviews about it. I'm going to show you my portion of the conversation at the end of the stream today, but I'm finding so much hope and excitement in legitimate conversations about how we take care of the beautiful places around us rather than the meaningless, hollow, virtue signaling activism that I feel like the loudest voices in the environmental space have been embracing lately. And I don't know about you guys, but generally speaking, I'm really sick and tired of the image being, if you care about the environment, you are Greta Thunberg and you throw temper tantrums all the time and you throw soup at paintings and you have to halt Broadway musicals and you're engaging in meaningless lawsuits that mean absolutely nothing, which is exactly what we are talking about today, because there are much more productive conversations we could be having, and we'll segue into that for the second half of the stream. As we're getting started, do me a huge favor if you guys haven't already and hit the like button on this stream. That could look like a little thumbs up or a heart depending on where you're watching, and most importantly, smash that follow or subscribe button to help us continue growing these communities organically, one day at a time. We're going to say hi to just a few people real quick before we jump into all of the craziness going on in the world. We've got Elias watching in Lebanon. So cool. Anti-KAC is watching from Turkey. We've got Hammer watching, says, get to the chopper. Yeah, good stuff. Absolutely what was going through my brain the entire time on Monday, which was fantastic. We've got Beto watching from Venezuela, so very cool. Brian says, let's sue the city of Chicago. Yeah, we all should, to be totally honest with you. Aqua Blue is watching from southern Maine, beautiful place in the world. We've got Tulsa, India, Michigan, Fairbanks, Alaska, my favorite state in the US of A, Tampa, Cincinnati. Over on locals, we've got Mrock, Alex, Tito, Nitty Witty, and more all tuning in on Rumble. Glock Fanboy, Old Man Trucker, and my Quillwin are kicking things off for us in the chat. Over on YouTube, we've got Delane, TKG, Miguel, Total Package, and more. I love you guys so very much, and I hope you can all engage in my mutual hatred, our mutual hatred of the city of Chicago, Illinois today, because they are just the pits, like truly the worst. And I cannot continue wrapping my head around the horrible decisions that the city of Chicago continues to make and then calls themselves a nice place to live. So I guess let's just start with that. I'm scrolling through the news today and I'm trying to figure out what's going on in the world, see what we can talk about on the stream. And I come across this headline that just stops me in my tracks. And let me just say up front, you might consider yourself to be a huge environmental activist. You might consider yourself to be a very large proponent of oil and gas, what some would call fossil fuels. You might consider yourself to be somebody wanting to outlaw fossil fuels. Wherever you're coming from on this issue, let's all just collectively agree that whatever the hell Chicago is doing, we all should probably be doing the opposite, because it's doing nothing productive in society to care for the environment. What do I mean by that? Chicago this week has become the latest city to sue the oil industry over the issue of climate change. So Chicago and several other cities and states have all joined together to generate lawsuits against oil companies, specifically to hold fossil fuel producers financially accountable for the effects of climate change. Specifically, their lawsuit is against 6 different oil companies, looking to hold these companies themselves financially accountable for the effects of climate change. And we're going to get into what this lawsuit actually looks like, but just to start this conversation, is Chicago insinuating that they have some other magical way today to power their city for the several million residents who live in the metropolitan/suburban area around Chicago? Do they not think that the people who drive cars in their city are responsible for this? Do they not think that the businesses powering their warehouses and factories are responsible for this? Do they not think their own government buildings might be responsible for some emissions? I don't know. Presumably not. It is the people who create the products that Chicago, including the government, still has to use in order to stay functional. That's the boogeyman in this situation. So putting my progressive politician cap on, naturally, the only way to save the planet is for our city to sue the company giving us a product that we are using to be in existence, to power things, to have an office and employ people and send out these frivolous, stupid lawsuits. It's our God-given responsibility and obligation to sue that company. I don't know what we'll do when we don't have their products, but we're just going to get rid of them first to save the planet. And then we'll figure everything else out afterwards. Read this because this is just wild. This was last Tuesday, so a week ago Tuesday. Chicago filed a lawsuit against 6 different oil companies and an influential industry ally, joining the ranks around the country of local governments looking to hold fossil fuel producers financially accountable for the effects of climate change. The lawsuit filed in the Cook County Circuit Court accused the companies, all of their subsidiaries, and the American Petroleum Institute, so just like the entire oil and gas industry at large, specifically accuses these companies of waging a campaign to discredit climate science and to mislead the public about the dangers of burning fossil fuels. Again, would love to ask, just out of total curiosity, if anybody knows the answer to this, would love to know. How is the car that the mayor drives to City Hall powered to get him to work every day? How are all of the security vehicles that keep the mayor safe powered every single day while he's on the job? How is the electricity kept on at City Hall in Chicago? Would be a nice question to be answering here. Does anybody know any of the answers to these questions? Because while they're trying to say that we're ruining the planet by engaging in the fossil fuels industry, it would just be a darn shame if the city of Chicago in and of itself would be participating in such overt and devastating destruction. While defendants have promoted and profited from their deceptive conduct, the city and its residents have spent and will continue to spend substantial sums to recover from the effects of climate change, the lawsuit says, noting that Chicago is facing more frequent and intense storms, flooding, droughts, and extreme heat. The lawsuit specifically names BP Oil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, Phillips 66, Shell, and API, the American Petroleum Institute, all as defendants, and says that the climate effects are felt throughout every part of the city and disproportionately in low-income communities. The consequences of this crisis are severe, said the mayor, as are the costs of surviving them. That is why we are seeking to hold these defendants accountable. They said in the city of Chicago, based upon the mayor's statements here, that there were unprecedented poor air quality standards in 2023 and a bunch of floods inundated the residents of Chicago's basements because of all of the climate stuff that is going on. Just for the record, there are more than 24 other cities, counties, and states in America that have filed similar lawsuits. So theoretically, this could all just get lumped into one giant class action suit against these 6 different companies and the oil industry at large. Fascinating. Also fascinating to me, by the way, that our government provides immunity for basically every other mega corporation, no matter what sort of damages they provide to society at large. I think about big pharma companies, for example, which enjoy blanket immunity for any damage that they might cause to people. We literally, under law, cannot sue those companies because they are granted immunity. But all of a sudden, other people and other companies and other corporations aren't granted immunity for very similar legal reasons. Almost like there might be a lot more to the story going on behind the scenes here. Of course, there's a ton of lawyers that have come out against this and said that basically these cases have no legal merit, that the judicial branch is not the appropriate place to decide climate policy, which obviously makes sense, right? If we're trying to legislate a change in how we power things in America and where our electricity comes from, be that oil and gas or renewable energy with solar and wind and hydroelectric, or I don't know, God forbid, the always off limits case of nuclear that we can never talk about in America. That never is supposed to happen through the judicial branch. We're not supposed to be legislating from the bench. We're supposed to be having these conversations in Congress, at the White House, etc., never from the bench of a court case. So obviously there's not a lot of legal merit here, but it opens up an interesting can of worms to talk about how people are approaching energy policy around the world and what people are angry about when it comes to fossil fuels use and oil and gas as an industry at large. Because immediately what comes to mind for me over the last several years is a really destructive level of dialogue that's been happening around the world because we're not able to have a legitimate conversation. Instead, it's just people saying, oil bad, gas bad, everything else good, and I need to cause as much of a temper tantrum to make that known to the world as possible if I'm serious about saving the planet. I'm sure you all have seen videos from the Just Stop Oil group that thankfully really doesn't speak for the environmental community at large, but sadly in the media has come to embrace the megaphone of that type of role and responsibility. But in case you've been living under a rock and you've missed a couple of these clips that have gone viral over the last couple of years, this is the entire conversation happening, at least in the media, about oil, about gas, and about renewable energy. You hear him screaming there, just stop oil, just stop oil. By the way, Les Mis is my favorite musical of all time. I've seen it like 12 times. I sing that song all the time when I'm cleaning my house. Interrupt Les Mis and you've made an enemy out of me for life. But like, honest to God question, what does climbing up on stage during the middle of a Broadway musical production to say just stop oil after you've all spent great money to go see a musical? It's not a hefty, or it's not a light fee. It's a pretty hefty fee to go see a musical in real life. What did this accomplish, if anything?
A 200-year-old historic arch was sprayed orange by Just Stop Oil.
This is in London. This is the Wellington Arch there in London. It's 200 years old. We're now spray painting these historic landmarks with, get this, oil-based paint using canisters, metal canisters that took oil to produce the canisters to hold these paints. We are now spraying 200-year-old historic landmarks and arches because that's the only way that we will be able to save the planet, according to this small group of lunatics. You have got to be kidding me. Like, what do you honestly think you're doing?
Struck again at an esports tournament. So it all started at a Tekken tournament.
And we're interrupting esports tournaments now because video games are directly responsible for the destruction of the planet.
Tournament, which is kind of like Street Fighter, and these Just Stop Oil protesters come and rub orange paint all over the players' monitors, and then she comes in with a little squirt gun and starts spraying the screen. These protests baffle me. I mean, anyone that sees these just hate them. And I feel like when you...
Facts. That's the only thing you're actually accomplishing. Anyone who sees videos like this just hates these people. And honestly, it's sad because it shuts down a productive conversation of, Is there a different way or a more productive way or even a more efficient way that we could be powering our society? I don't know. We'll never get there because instead of actually just sitting down and having an interesting conversation about it, these people just have to destroy everyone's private property or public property that's been generationally appreciated for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and then say they're saving the planet in the process.
You're protesting, you want to almost gain sympathy for your cause, but every single protest I've seen for Just Stop Oil is ridiculous. I agree that we need to use less oil, but do I stand with these people? I don't even want to be associated with these people.
Facts.
Why at an esports tournament? That has nothing to do with oil. That's my opinion. What do y'all think?
I'd like to make one thing perfectly clear. We did no damage to the painting whatsoever.
We did no damage to a priceless, historic, original Van Gogh painting by throwing cans of tomato soup at it. I'm sure you guys all saw that clip when it was going live for the first time. Here is the protester for Just Stop Oil explaining how she felt this was her only option, the only option to save the planet.
It's behind glass, and we never ever would have considered doing it if we didn't know that it was behind glass and that we wouldn't do any damage. I recognise that it looks like a slightly ridiculous action. I agree, it is ridiculous. But we're not asking the question, should everybody be throwing soup on paintings? What we're doing is getting the conversation going so we can ask the questions that matter. Questions like, is it okay that Liz Truss is licensing over 100 new fossil fuel licenses? Is it okay that fossil fuels are subsidised 30 times more than renewables when offshore wind is currently 9 times cheaper than fossil fuels? This is the conversation we need to be having now.
But nobody's going to have this conversation with you if you've just painted yourself in the public light as throwing a temper tantrum by throwing tomato soup on a Van Gogh painting. Like, what? And she admits it to herself that it's really just to seek attention. That's the only actual method that these people are enabling here because they don't want answers to those questions. They don't want to even facilitate the conversation. They just want to spark the initial attention, the initial outrage, to manufacture your outrage, to make this a trending viral story on the internet to begin with.
Because we don't have time to waste. We're using these actions to get media attention because we need to get people talking about this now. And we know that civil resistance works. History has shown us that it works. I'm stood here today as a queer woman, and the reason that I'm
naturally so important
able to vote, the reason I'm able to go to university, hopefully someday marry the person I love, is because of people who have taken part in civil resistance before me.
They've smashed cake on the wax figure of King Charles III. They threw soup on Van Gogh's famous Sunflowers painting, adhered themselves to a copy of Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, and spray-painted luxury car dealerships with orange paint, all in protest of new oil production sites. So who's doing the protests? Just Stop Oil, a UK-based activist coalition. Their goal is to stop the government from creating any new licenses for the production of fossil fuels, and they're hoping to raise awareness for their cause with these civil resistance protests. The group claims the protests are a powerful way for people to non-violently demand their rights, freedom, and justice. And while they are getting a lot of media coverage, it's not yet clear if the stunts will spark any real change.
So they're saying this is their non-violent way of seeking rights and justice. I just have a question in chat. You guys might be able to help me with this. I don't understand what rights these people don't have that they have to throw mashed potatoes or a can of tomato soup or paint on someone else's property and or in the midst of an art museum to demand. What rights are missing from the conversation here that demand this type of nonviolent outrage? I don't fully understand that. Yusuf just said in our chat, in Italy, we have an influencer who is vandalizing and violating paintings and statues. I think this is happening all over Europe. Certainly now is happening all over the United States as well. But it's very confusing and at the very least is completely unproductive, right? No matter what your personal opinion might be on energy sources, if you're like a diehard oil and gas person, if you hate oil and gas and you wish we had 100% renewables, if you wish that we had a better mix of all of the above, which I think is where the average person probably is coming from, no part of this type of activism is actually effective in generating important conversations about what conservation should look like and what environmentalism should look like. Henrik says they're just stupid people. And Kate says they have all the rights. They fight for rights to protect kids online. So wait, what? They have plenty of rights. This isn't a peaceful protest when you destroy public property. Sorry, I was misreading that. Yeah, exactly. It's not demanding any right that you don't have, and it's not quite peaceful if you're engaging in destruction of property. It's just bizarre. A lot of you guys are saying we should talk about these issues, but not like this. And that's a perfect segue into what I want to share with you on the second half of the stream today, saying that there are insane people out there. There are attention-seeking, frankly, brats who will throw food on things, who will destroy public property, who will vandalize private property, who will scream and cry and yell in the middle of art museums to try to just generate outrage. They said that themselves. Their entire MO in all of this is to generate and manufacture outrage and attention, not to actually seek solutions to a lot of the environmental issues that we say that we're facing today. Yes, those people exist. There are crazy, insane, woke, progressive politicians like, I don't know, the mayor of Chicago, who is constantly surrounded by oil and gas to fuel and power his everyday life in order to exist as an individual and or serve the city of Chicago. I'm using that term very loosely, as a public servant, as the mayor of Chicago, who then takes it upon themselves to sue several different oil companies for destroying the planet, even though they personally benefit from it every day. That type of politician absolutely does exist, and they're existing with higher frequency and louder voices and bigger megaphones every single day in the Western world, in the United States and around Europe and pretty much everywhere else as well. But the good news is there's also really good people and good organizations out there trying to facilitate important conversations about the environment from very, very, very different points of view than what these loud, crazy, insane individuals happen to be doing every day. And that's where I want to share with you guys a little bit about the event that I was able to participate in on Monday in California with the American Conservation Coalition. If you guys have never checked out ACC, they do some really incredible work writing legislation, lobbying on the Hill. They do a lot of youth activism on college campuses and online. If you guys have ever heard of stuff like the Great American Outdoors Act, which was introduced and passed under the Trump administration, or the Trillion Trees Initiative, or a lot of the conservation work that we do in the state of Florida, where I live today, related to the Everglades, ACC has had their hands in every single one of those projects, and they are incredibly brilliant, smart, educated, patient, sane individuals that are trying to remind the world that you don't have to be a screaming leftist. You don't have to pour paint and mashed potatoes all over paintings in art galleries. You don't have to say, "How dare you," at UN conferences in order to care about the earth. And they decided to put together this really cool, never been done before event that I was asked to participate in on Monday for a bipartisan youth environmental roundtable with former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who has taken on a lot of leadership in the environmental and anti-pollution space. He still lobbies for that today. The Hill was able to cover it from a media perspective, and they hosted the more conservative side of things, while another organization hosted the more leftist side of things. And it was really interesting to sit down with people who have very, very dramatically different points of view than myself, political opinions than myself, values and worldviews than myself. But we were all kind of saying really similar things at the end of the day, that we wanted to remind people caring about the earth and involving yourself in conservation and environmentalism is not a partisan issue, that we don't think it should be a partisan issue from an American politics perspective, and that we all have a responsibility and an obligation to care for our environment at large, both at the personal responsibility level and for our communities at large. So part of this event ended up getting covered by The Hill, and they sat me down with a left-wing counterpart, a young man named Isaias, And we had a really interesting conversation. I would love to share with you just a few minutes of that because I hope it opens your eyes to the truth, to the historical reality, and to the objective fact that the word conserve is right there in the middle of the word conservative for a reason. Because in fact, throughout American history, it has been loud conservative voices championing some of the most important environmental policies of modern history. So without further ado, check out this clip from my conversation with The Hill at the American Conservation Coalition's event on Monday.
In my next Bipartisan segment, I spoke to Isabel Brown, a conservative social media influencer and author of the book, The End of the Alphabet, How Gen Z Can Save America, and Isaias Hernandez, environmental educator and creator of Queer Brown Vegan, an independent media platform. He started to bring intersectional environmental education to all. Enjoy the conversation. Okay, Isaias, we'll start with you. Tell us about your moniker, Queer Brown Vegan.
Yeah, so my platform is just really rooted in environmental literacy. So it really represents the different intersectional identities, but also the multicultural ways in which society has really evolved. And so part of me was just to recognize that, you know, our identities are very unique to each and every one of them, and really wanted to represent that within the movement space, and recognizing that, you know, we don't just follow one culture. We are really based on diversity of cultures.
Yeah, and talk about how that kind of segues into environmentalism and climate spaces.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to environmental spaces, often at times there is misconceptions and myths that, you know, people of color don't care about the environment and that, you know, they let themselves live in polluted environments. But I think it's important to recognize history and like context. So when we look at, you know, for example, industries in low-income communities of color, or those in rural communities that are white, we often think, well, what came first, the poor community or the toxic industry? And so I think for me, it was really important to address that many communities, specifically those in poverty, often adopt these narratives of like, yes, I deserve to be in these environments because I didn't work hard in life, did not achieve the American dream. And so I think for many people of color and marginalized communities, they really have been subjected to some of the highest level rates of pollution. And I think part of me is to really advocate for marginalized communities to recognize that they are part of this conversation, that they do care about the environment, and that they do want to see a healthy world for everyone.
And Isabel, you often don't hear, you know, conservative or Republican in the same sentence as environmentalism, climate. And I know you spend a lot of time explaining this activism to older conservatives. How do you do that, and how is it being received?
Oh, I love this question because I think it's fascinating to hear that we, for some reason, have arrived at a time where the words conservative and conservationist don't belong in the same sentence, when in reality, the word conserve is right there in the word conservative, and it always has been for a reason. We've bought into this modern lie from society in the last several decades that they are mutually exclusive, and that if you prefer limited government, if you believe in God-given rights, if you want to prioritize freedom of expression or freedom of religion, a lot of these conservative buzz topics that we talk about all day, then that automatically precludes you from participating in any conversation about environmentalism. But I've really gone through a transformative experience in the last several months and years educating myself about the history of conservation in America and around the world because of the work that we do here in the United States. You know, it was President Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president, that set aside the first public land in the United States with the Yosemite Grant Act. You look at Teddy Roosevelt, who spearheaded the idea of the National Park Service and really was the greatest environmental president of all time, inarguably. Richard Nixon, a Republican, started the EPA. Even the Trump administration that just concluded had some of the most forward-thinking environmental policies of our time with modern presidents. Look at the Great American Outdoors Act and the Trillion Trees Initiative. So really this story and history of conservation baked right into the word conservative has always been there since the beginning of modern conservatism with the founding of the Republican Party. But for whatever reason, we've really lost that story. So it's really exciting to see groups like American Conservation Coalition really facilitating these conversations again, to know that it's not a partisan issue, to believe we all have a responsibility and an obligation to care for our beautiful spaces and to share them with others for generations to come.
And we know that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has talked quite a bit about conservation, particularly when it comes to the Everglades.
Absolutely.
And some of those areas in Florida. But at the same time, among some of these leading national Republican figures, you don't hear this topic talked about. I mean, why don't you think this is higher on the agenda?
Oh, wow. I mean, if I could answer that question, we'd have a much different political landscape in America today. But I'm really finding that there's so much of a divide in the country that we live in today. We often think that divide exists between left and right more than anything else, but I've come to believe there's far more of a generational divide when it comes to our values than there is partisanly between the left and the right. If you look at issues that young people, young voters from across the political spectrum care about today, they largely center around social issues. Whether you fall on one side or the other with these social issues. We can talk about school safety and gun control. You could talk about the abortion and pro-life conversation happening in America, and obviously the climate and environment as well. For whatever reason, the old guard of the Republican Party, and largely a lot of conservatives that have been in office longer than twice the time that we've been alive, can't really latch on to this idea of social change being upstream from politics. They want to convince you that your wallet is on the ballot with every passing major election in midterms and presidential elections. I think the left has been very effective with our generation by convincing you that your life is on the ballot, and that if you don't support all of our policies and every single solution to these social problems that you're dealing with, then you just don't care about them. So I don't know that it's really a lack of concern or care from our elected officials as much as it is a strategic avoidance of these issues under the assumption they're going to lose public support, when in reality I think it's going to dramatically help conservatives in office if they lean more into these social conversations.
And Isaiah, you've talked about how you're passionate about climate literacy. What does that exactly mean?
Yeah, so climate literacy is a little bit different from environmental literacy, is that climate really focuses on bringing in the topics around racial, social, and environmental justice. And I know that for justice and equity, that is something that is not so much not talked about, but rather misconstrued in different ways or reanalyzed in definitions of political parties. And so I think with climate literacy, the reason why it's so important to really educate that is that today, our generations that we have today we are the social media generation. So 25% of people are learning about climate or environmental related issues through social media, which is then a larger percentage with traditional media, and then you go into TVs and films. So climate literacy is also looking at the fact of how do we talk about greenhouse gases? How do we talk about emissions or pollutions? And so the climate aspect is really understanding the systems itself of our Earth-related sciences, of how they're really congregating and how they're really infecting or influencing the ways that we live as a society, such as the draining of water resources happening here in America from lack of access to clean air. So all of these things are very important to understand, whereas I think environmental literacy kind of also talks generally about the importance of saving the environment and some of the history. And I think with climate literacy allows us to further validate that as an extension of what are the other systems and mechanisms that are happening beyond the health and aspects and social.
Do you two find that language surrounding, whether it's language about climate or the environment, do you think that's a roadblock between liberals and progressives from coming together on this issue? Maybe they don't understand each other. Maybe they don't hear each other. And what do you guys think?
Absolutely. We just had a very productive roundtable conversation about this very topic, that it often feels like we're living in two different Americas today, largely because of our extremely polarized media. Social media obviously plays into that, but I think is helping to break some of those echo chambers by independent voices like us continuing to facilitate dialogue. But really, we're operating with two completely separate vocabularies. If you look at a word like climate, for example, it means two completely different things to a person that you're asking, depending on where they're coming from in the political world today in America. Sadly, everything has become a political connotation, down to the toothbrush that you used this morning or the underwear that you're wearing right now as you watch this video. And I think we get so defensive about defending our definition of that word that it often makes it really difficult for us to let our guards down and just have a productive conversation.
Right.
And I absolutely agree too. I think that, it really depends on the different individuals, how they see it. But collectively, I think that we can agree that caring for life and humanity is a very shared common culture and story for all of society. And I do think that, if we're able to really understand that basis of foundation, I do think that we can come together to say, yes, we can work on this, while we may not always agree politically on the things that we say. And I think that it's normal to disagree as human beings. And I think that's something that we have to remember as we continuously progress into a more destabilized political world that we're entering, of how do we really keep those shambles intact for each other.
And Generation Z has been a huge voice on the environment, talking about how, and climate, talking about how they want to leave this world, better than, they started it with. Talk about Generation Z in the activist community. How are they performing activism? How are they going about this when it comes to environment and climate?
I like to say that we're really reinventing the wheel in a lot of different capacities when it comes to American politics and culture today. I literally just wrote the book on Gen Z that's coming out next month, and it's called The End of the Alphabet, as a nod to kind of the end of life as we know it, because we often hear from both sides of the political spectrum, namely in legacy media, that Gen Z is the end of America. Gen Z is destroying everything that we've known to be good and true and beautiful. But if we look around at the status quo of America today and we see record anxiety, depression, and suicidation, we see substance abuse, we see lack of care for our communities and the environment that we live in, we see record polarization where we automatically assume someone who disagrees with us on one subject is demonic or evil, and we can't even sit down and have a conversation. Maybe the end of life as we know it isn't so bad. So we're doing that in a ton of different ways. We're kind of rejecting this prescribed pathway to success that I think has been fed to us as a generation. We're not getting 4-year degrees in liberal arts as much as we have been the last several decades, and skipping to entrepreneurship and starting our own activism organizations instead. 62% of our generation has already started their own business, which I find incredibly telling. We're turning off the TV and radio, and we're watching videos on Instagram and TikTok and live streams on YouTube to be educated with honest, real commentary. People aren't trying to hide their bias, but being honest about how they feel about things in the world, and bridging some of those dialogues as well. And in the activism space, the most important thing, I think, is that we're not waiting for permission to lead. We've been told as a generation for far too long that we're too young, we're too inexperienced, we're too naive to actually make a difference in the world of American politics and world geopolitics at large too. So we're supposed to sit down and shut up until we gain enough life experience to get to that point. But we're not waiting, and we're charging ahead, which I think really speaks to the American story of why young voices have always been needed. I ask this question to high schools and colleges a lot when I speak on campus to describe what the founding fathers looked like. And if you flip through our AP US history textbooks or go to any gallery art museum in Washington, D.C., the answer is pretty much always old white men, that they were these sagging, geriatric, completely culturally irrelevant people that had no way of building a society that could stand the test of time. But really, on July 4th, 1776, our founding fathers were 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. Thomas Jefferson was only 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And so we like to say we're in this revolutionary moment, in a culture war, a 1776 moment, some presidential candidates have been saying, in 2024. And I think a lot of that is being spearheaded by Gen Z, refusing to wait our turn and grasping that American story of youth activism again.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think with, with Gen Z grassroots activists on my end with like leftist movements, I think they're very much involved in like direct action, disinvestment, of boycotting, but also I think respectively, either you're Republican or Democrat, we will vote you out if you're not committed to those policies. And I think it is a very clear indication that more than ever, as this progression of our society continues to get older and more young people every day are eligible to vote, they are no longer communicating to the older generations. They're communicating to us. And so if they're not able to commit to that rhetoric versus the reality, then they are at fear of not losing their jobs, their career, their statuses. So that is important to them and their family and their cultural status that they've built over their years of political advocacy. So it is in our best interest to recognize that if we are not going to recognize these things as an issue, we will find other candidates that are very suitable that will be able to tackle the environment and to say, I may not agree fully with the concept around climate change, but I want to save the earth. I want to save pollution. So let's actually come together. And I think realistically, that's how we're seeing it, is that we can save this democracy. It's just that it needs to be done right and communicated effectively.
And just to wrap up, you hear people say, I maybe lean left or lean right, young people, members of Gen Z, but I don't see Gen Z enthusiastically lining up behind the Democratic platform or the Republican platform. They seem to like this I don't want to be labeled approach. From your perspectives, do you see them embracing that approach when it comes to the environmental and climate activist community?
Oh, absolutely. And that speaks volumes with the data as well, that 52% of our generation who are newly registering to vote are choosing to register as independents. 52%, which is completely unheard of from a generational perspective. We're kind of seen as this prize to be won over in American politics, that for so long people and generations at large have pledged their allegiance to one color and one letter at the end of your voter registration, and you'll automatically vote down ticket that way every November. But kind of for the first time ever, we're really embracing individuality and independence in buying into the policies and the individuals that we know are going to follow through on those policies that we really care about. So we're voting with our values first rather than party first. And I hope that creates a conversation about candidate quality, about becoming a United States of America again together rather than being so divided moving forward. And just re-engaging young people in this crazy system experiment that we call America. Most people assume young people just don't care. But if we look at the last several elections, we have record youth voter turnout from every single major election since we've been able to vote.
Right.
Sorry, don't know what happened there. I loved participating in that conversation with The Hill and with the American Conservation Coalition. I'm seeing a lot of you guys drop in our chat. We're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic. Yes, the number of times that I wanted to interrupt that conversation in the middle of when it was happening and say, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. But I decided I had different hills to die on that day. Correct. You are all correct. We are a constitutional republic, not a democracy. But I do just think it's so interesting that once you peeled back a lot of the layers of the buzzwords that young man was saying about certain political proclivities and issues and points of views, I do think it's interesting when you get to the meat and potatoes of what he was saying. We were kind of saying the same thing, right? Elected officials have not actually followed through on any of the things that they've promised to do, and I'm really feeling disenfranchised by my side of the political aisle. I might think that climate change is this big issue, and you might think that pollution or all kinds of other environmental issues are these big problems. Let's see where we can come together and create meaningful policy and meaningful dialogue moving forward with all of this in our generation's political identity. Where can we figure out ways to create actual tangible solutions rather than just being at each other's throats all the time and throwing soup on everything? It's an interesting place to start. And there was a lot of the conversation that actually wasn't filmed with a much larger group of people in the actual roundtable. And during that conversation, this exact young man who I sat down with, which I thought was interesting, said that among young leftists, their number one fear about the 2024 election is that there's going to be a Republican president reelected back into office, and rampant authoritarianism is going to come back into American politics. That's the line that's being fed to young people on the left side of the aisle in the media that they're consuming. And I kind of chuckled and I looked at him and said, well, that's funny you say that, because if you ask any young conservative what our biggest fear is in the 2024 election, it's another Democrat candidate or a certain set of policies being elected back into office and instituting rampant leftist authoritarianism into American politics. And so I'm really hopeful, and I feel a lot of promise with our generation wanting to break free of this really vicious cycle. But we talked all day at this event hosted by ACC about actual solutions related to environmental issues that will benefit all of us. Like, number one, perhaps most importantly, nuclear power. Why people refuse to acknowledge the cleanliness, effectiveness, cheap nature, etc. of nuclear power happening in America. I still cannot wrap my head around this, but there are a lot of good people spearheading the effort here in the United States, and I hope that you guys can do a lot more research on it yourself, because even if it makes you feel a little bit uneasy, I can promise you it is cleaner, cheaper, safer, anything than you ever could have imagined than what you've been told from American media and from American politicians, and it's got to be a part of the conversation moving forward. We talked about public lands, we talked about dialogue, and even all of the leftist climate change people at this event all said they were sick and tired of the Just Stop Oil people throwing soup everywhere and stopping traffic and interrupting Broadway musicals because they aren't doing anything meaningful to facilitate dialogue and actually create change. We talked about the National Park Service. I mean, I could keep going example by example by example, but it really wasn't this divisive, angry, partisan debate, I guess is the right word that I'm looking for. It truly was a conversation, and I think a window into exposing our generation to the importance of personal responsibility and limited government, that it's all of our responsibility to care for our own backyard rather than trying to grow the government by an unprecedented exponential amount that isn't going to solve for anything. So I hope you guys enjoyed all of that. I'm really, really tired of all this crap that we're seeing from politicians and from screaming protesters, but I hope that you can see that there is room for hope and all kinds of great dialogue moving forward. In the interest of saving my voice to be on Officer Tatum's show this afternoon, we're going to cut the stream right there. I love you guys so, so very much. I hope you have the best weekend ever. Pray for me in going to see Dune 2 tonight with my fiance. I was not the biggest fan of Dune 1, to be honest with you, so I hope that I don't fall asleep in the movie theater. I have higher expectations and higher hopes for this next round. We'll just put it that way. And we will be back for the stream Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern with a very, very exciting guest. I'm trying to decide whether or not to tell you. She is a legend in I don't want to give it away. Do I give it away? Do I just tell you? She's a legend. We'll just put it that way. And you guys will absolutely love hearing from her on the stream. So come back Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern if you want to meet my new friend and a very special guest. And do me a favor as you guys are leaving and like this stream if you haven't already. Hit that thumbs up or heart button and smash that subscribe or follow button to keep helping us grow our communities. Catch me over on Brandon Tatum's show, the Officer Tatum podcast show, later this afternoon. And I will see you guys after the weekend. Bye.